Okay. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fall 2022 Sustainability Speaker Series. This will be our first speaker. I wanted to introduce Caleb Quaid, who's going to be speaking to you today about regeneration, the practical introduction to nature's climate solution. Um, Mr. Quaid is an MBA and a lead AP and founder of Generative Shift. Kata Quaid is a regenerative consultant and founder of Regenerative Shift, an environmental consulting firm focused on assisting businesses and communities with the transition to regenerative practices. In 2022, the Regenerative Shift, Caleb worked with Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida, to plant the first regenerative planting project in North America in professional sports with a 1,100-foot living fence of bamboo and native plants. He focuses on projects with mainstream high-profile businesses as a means to energize the regenerative movement into everyday conversations. Prior to forming Regenerative Shift in 2021, Caleb spent 12 years working with the NFL, mostly with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a senior operations and project management role. During this time with the Buccaneers, he also oversaw the stadium operations, plant operations, game operations, facilities, and construction management projects totaling to over $200 million in renovations and new construction. His passion for regenerative blends into his personal and social life. He and his sons, Kobe and Atlas, operate a small front yard permaculture community garden from their home in Tampa, Florida, where neighbors can pick their own produce to enjoy. And without further ado, I will allow Caleb to take over and tell us more about his organization and his emphasis on regenerative shifting. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to get in front of people and talk about what is definitely my favorite topic and something I'm really passionate about, which is regeneration. As Dr. Dorsey mentioned, my background is mostly in professional sports. I worked with the Buccaneers, the Miami Dolphins, and the Florida Gators over the years, and kind of made this shift in my own personal life. And I'll talk into some of what's got me juiced about it, but I'm really excited to share what I think is a really important topic with you guys, and certainly for those of you that are involved in sustainability, either as a student or as a faculty. I think a really important thing to be well versed in and be studying, and hopefully I can share a little insight on that and excite some people about it today. So wanted to get into a lot of this, but first, want to see with who's on here if there's anybody who will raise their hand and try to give me their definition of regeneration. I'm kind of wondering where people are. And a lot of meetings I'm in, most people have never heard of it, but suspect maybe in this room there's a couple that maybe have. So would love anybody who wants to volunteer and let me know what they think regeneration means to them. Quiet crowd, no problem.
Well, okay, so let me take a shot at it. So regeneration, I think, is when you are trying to restore a system that maybe has been degraded or damaged or something to bring it back to, a level of operation or a life that it used to have. Is that close enough?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, typically, like the conventional definition would be going beyond sustainability and actually healing or doing, where sustainability is like kind of not harming, regeneration be taking it to actually where you're helping nature through the practices that you're having. So yeah, it's a pretty common one. I will get into, I agree with that definition. I'll get into a little bit later the definition that kind of drives my passion with it in a little bit here, but appreciate that, Dr. Dorsey. So kind of as a little bit of an overview kind of what regeneration is, I'll give a history. So it started, generally speaking, when people talk about regeneration until very recently, it's been around the idea of regenerative agriculture, and specifically regenerative agriculture compared to industrial agriculture. And in some ways, this has been going on for thousands of years. There are a lot of indigenous traditions that have had really good agriculture practices, and so don't want to diminish that. But in terms of the modern sense of where regenerative agriculture as a buzzword kind of came around, it's credited to the Rodale family in like the 1960s and the Rodale Institute and some of the practices that they started to implement there. Also, there's a pioneer in the field that those that are familiar with regenerative agriculture may be familiar with, Joel Salatin. He has Polyface Farm in Virginia. That's a really good example of some incredible practices of integrating animals with plants that does that. He does a lot of talks, so if you want to learn more about regenerative agriculture, can learn a lot from him. But generally speaking, regenerative agriculture has some principles to it. And if you're comparing it to industrial agriculture's primary metrics that it's judging are going to be output, yield per acre, profit. Sometimes efficiency or standardization so that they can ship it long distances or have something that looks the same as they're growing it. A lot of outside inputs coming in, typically monoculture, where you're just growing a whole field of corn or something like that, rather than looking at more of the inputs. And regenerative agriculture has some principles I'll get into, but kind of boils down to soil health as a primary metric. And that's not to say that profit and yield per acre and some of these things aren't critical to regenerative agriculture, because of course farmers need to make profit, and that's a critical element to it. But it starts with soil health and focusing on how healthy is the soil as your main input into the system that produces the output of your crop and yield. And so there's a few different things floating around. This one that I have here is from Kiss the Ground, but it kind of goes through 6 metrics that are the principles of regenerative agriculture. First is context. So looking at where you're growing things, both with, what zone are you growing in, and maybe where in your yard. Is it getting sun? Is it not getting sun? Is it a low spot that's going to be wet, or a high spot that's going to be dry? And planting things that are adapted and want to live and grow where you are. So it's not trying to force nature to grow by all these external inputs that would go into it. It's really more looking at what wants to grow on the land that you have, and growing that certainly means a lot less water and fertilizer if you're growing things that are adapted to it. Secondly, it focuses on minimizing the amount of disturbance to the soil. So whereas industrial agriculture will till the soil typically each year and stir it up to make it easier for the seeds to go in, and will add a lot of chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, regenerative agriculture tries to minimize that as much as possible and do no-till and try to not have things that are added to the soil that will disturb the natural soil environment. Another aspect they call living root, which most of the food that is produced that we eat is grown by annual crops. So like tomatoes and broccoli, and most of what you get in the grocery store, they come from seed, grow, get harvested, and die all in one year. But there are perennial crops that will grow for years and years that typically have much stronger root structures, are much more environmentally friendly, can become basis of ecosystems. And so regenerative agriculture certainly does use some annual crops in it, but typically is done in a system that has some perennial crops in it as well, so that you have living roots in the soil at all times. Additionally, regenerative agriculture protects the soil, puts some armor on it in the form of typically cover crops. So if you're growing corn, traditionally you might, at the end of your year, harvest your corn and leave the soil bare until the spring. This regenerative agriculture will plant another crop that will grow in that will help keep the soil moist, keep the sun off the crops and will, in some cases, if you're planting the right type of cover crop, will actually pull nitrogen and other nutrients out of the air and put them into the soil that will reduce the need for future fertilizers and stuff, and will protect that soil and keep it living. Regenerative agriculture also integrates animals and plants together. A lot of our food production, we have animal feedlots, and we are growing the food that they're eating completely in a different site and then trucking it to them. Regenerative agriculture looks at ways to integrate plants and animals together, more like how nature works, and does that system in a way that can really produce some amazing results. And all of this, it kind of ties together, but regenerative agriculture focuses on biodiversity. So it starts with the soil and having life and biodiversity within the soil, having different types of plants that are growing together, having animals integrated with it, and having nature around it still living. Biodiversity is a key element of regenerative agriculture, and all of that together kind of produces soil health as an output. Why is that important? So, soil health, it turns out, is critically important to environmental health. Like if you looked at soil health and water health together, you couldn't overstate the importance of those two systems being healthy for the health of our overall environment. But soil health in particular, talking about that, healthy soil produces healthier food. There is a noticeable macronutrient profile difference between things that are grown with living soil, with healthy soil, than with things that are grown with chemicals. And it produces healthier food. And certainly if you're using pesticides and things like Roundup on your food, that has an impact on the health of the food that you're eating. Healthy soil is full of life. If you have soil that's been treated with pesticides and Roundup, you might pick up a handful of it and literally have absolutely no living creatures in that whole handful whatsoever. Whereas healthy soil, whether it's done regenerative agriculture or just healthy soil in general, might have more life in it than there are people on the planet. And that is critical for the biodiversity and the ecosystems within where that soil is growing. The little tiny microbes feed bigger things all the way up to apex predators. It's the basis of the food chain, and that starts with healthy soil. Healthy soil also is incredible at cleaning water. When it rains, healthy soil is porous and will let the water soak in through it. There are actually the microbes and different little creatures there will process that water and filter out some of the nutrients and stuff that's in it. And there's also silt and carbon and lots of things in the soil as it soaks down into the soil and down into aquifers that cleans and filters and creates that beautiful spring water that we have. And that's done through healthy soil. Healthy soil, there's also the added bonus that basically the worst thing that you can do that we do on a large scale to water is how we manage our landscapes and our lawns and our current agriculture, where we're pouring all these chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and running that off into our waterways. I have a picture down here of some of the red tide that I think all of us in this area are probably quite familiar with. That's in no small part caused by our agricultural and landscape maintenance practices that we have in this region. So you've got this beautiful situation where it not only cleans water, but it also offsets the need for something that's the worst thing that we could possibly do to water. So it's pretty amazing for that. And finally, and the one that really blew my mind when I learned it a couple years ago, and is a big reason why I've shifted my focus to doing this as a career, is healthy soil captures and stores tons of carbon per acre, literally. And so this graphic that I have on here is from the Rodale Institute. They did a couple studies, one in 2014, another in 2020, where they looked at the land that we have for crops and for pasture worldwide, and analyzed the carbon content and analyzed the practices, and came up with this extrapolation that if we were to switch from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture worldwide, it would offset our global carbon emissions. So we could be net zero as a planet in a couple years just by making this one, albeit pretty large, change to the way that we manage and grow and maintain our food and land as it relates to agriculture. And I started looking at this, and that blew my mind when I first learned it. Started looking at this beyond just agriculture and looking at land as a whole. And there's in the top 18 inches of soil around the world, there's 3 times the amount of carbon currently than there is in the atmosphere globally. And as we look for our atmospheric carbon solutions and how do we get that, reduce our emissions and how do we draw that down, if we were to increase the amount of carbon in the soil by 6% globally, it would draw down and offset all of our carbon emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1800. And that's easier said than done. There's a lot of land. There's specific things that you need to do that. But it's a big piece of the puzzle, and we've done it in thousands of locations all over the world already, and we know how to do it. It's a pretty proven pathway that can be done on a lot of different types of land. There's an amazing documentary called Regreening the Desert that is available on YouTube that shows projects that this was done without adding irrigation to lands in Rwanda and Ethiopia, literally in desert, and growing trees and croplands in those spaces and healing the soil in it. And there's a project I want to highlight. It's kind of the most poster child of regenerative land management projects that there is. But in China, there's this area called the Loess Plateau. And if anybody out there has seen Kiss the Ground, this is highlighted in that. There's a lot of different highlights of this that you can find if you're looking in the right places. But this Loess Plateau was the agricultural capital of ancient China. And it was used to grow a lot of crops back in the day. And they, through their ancient irrigation practices, used a lot of water that had salt in it, salt water, to irrigate and grow crops. And that damaged the soil pretty badly over time. And, before we get all too high and mighty on those silly ancients that use salt water, we're spraying Roundup on everything, and that's far more damaging to soil than the salt water is. So we're not, actually we're doing it much worse than they did. Theirs lasted for hundreds, if not thousands of years before it degraded so badly. But nevertheless, for thousands of years, this area had so much erosion and so little soil health that it fed into what's known as the Yellow River because of all the different erosion that was running into it. And China decided to figure out something to do about it, and they teamed with the World Bank and funded this project in 1995 to 2007, where over 12 years, through pretty basic manual use and shovel labor, not even a lot of high equipment, they restored an area that's the size of Belgium, 35,000 square kilometers, to look like the before and the after there, really basically by just changing the way the water flowed, by doing some terracing of the land, and by selective planting of crops that could survive in that area and leaving it alone for a while. We showed that we can restore and raise carbon content in country-size projects here. So when I started learning this, I was like, well, this needs to get done at every level. Certainly there need to be people that are working on this countrywide level. There's people that need to look at, like I'm doing in my individual lawn, and how do I change the practices in my lawn. But I started looking at this giant gap outside of some agriculture, which, there's some regenerative agriculture needs to scale 1,000 times from what it is, but it is, it wasn't part of any corporate sustainability plans. It wasn't even a best practice. I came from the NFL, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Sports Sustainability Index that came out in 2021 doesn't list, as far as best practices for landscape management. It was to compost your landscape waste, which, yes, that's a good thing to do, and to use smart irrigation so you're not actively wasting water. There was nothing in it on even using adaptive plants or native plants that could build some biodiversity, and definitely nothing on, hey, use your land to sequester carbon through, plants that are doing this and can be measured to do it. That was missing. And so I noticed, looking at airports and stadiums and cities, and I'll get into universities like we're here talking about today, that there's a gap that it just needed to be implemented into corporate sustainability plans of how do we manage our land. And so wanted to do that. And so want to share with you guys a project that I'm really proud of. If any of you have heard of me, it's probably from this project. This is definitely the one I've gotten the most notoriety on. It's a project that we did at Raymond James Stadium. Dr. Dorsey mentioned it a little bit here. So I'm going to share my screen if you give me a moment here and try and play this video.
Hey, look, you're muted. Can't hear anything. Okay, well, I guess we just have to read this.
Hi, Caleb. I think when you are sharing your screen, you could also turn on the audio so that we can listen to your video. So I'll share it. So when you share it, then I think at the top there is audio to turn on. So turn it on so that we can hear.
Yeah, because we can't hear anything. Yeah, you might have to start again.
Yep. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, but when the video
guys hear me?
starts, we started to hear it initially, but then the music went away, and we couldn't even
Can
hear
you guys hear me or no?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you
Yeah,
hear us?
I apologize. I tried very hard to make that audio work, but it we'll just, I guess, skip it. So the it's in the video. You may not have heard it, but regeneration to me is putting life at the center of decision making, and this project was a really cool example of that because the stadium has had a business challenge. They had curb jumping into their parking lots that they were trying to solve for, and you could solve that pretty easily with an aluminum fence. But if you put life into the equation and think about it for a moment or two, there's a better way that you can do it that ended up costing less money, but also was living and put carbon back into the ground through the bamboo and created habitat for the birds and the bugs through the shiny wild coffee native plant that we put in there, and is something that I think is more beautiful and is a way that we can kind of look at our business challenges and not necessarily, yes, to what Professor Dorsey said earlier on, how do we try and get beyond sustainability and do that, right? The stadium has a long way to go to be, sustainable or to actually be a, regenerative environmental place. But at each decision, each opportunity is a chance to make a decision and make a point to move in the direction towards creating life. And so I think there are a lot of beautiful opportunities that we can take to move in that direction. Some of what I want to talk to you about from here today will be some, a couple ideas for USF that would make sense. And I'll preface it by saying I'm not on campus every day, and you guys are probably doing some of this stuff. And actually, I'll highlight some stuff that I know that you are doing. But just some ideas of things that would make some sense to look at. But first, I wanted to say, I don't know, people on here, if you're familiar with the Metropolitan Food Park that Dr. Christian Brichot is doing on your campus, and the Microbiome Institute, but any faculty or students that aren't familiar with this, I'd highly encourage you to look it up. Dr. Brichot is a leading expert in gut microbiome and in viruses, has done a lot of work with COVID-19 research and has led international organizations on it. But he's doing right now, he just got some funding for an amazing project that is looking at, I mentioned earlier that healthy soil produces healthier food. Well, he's actually going to do some research studies, I believe, on campus that's going to be looking at how food is grown and how that actually is affecting the microbiome within your gut based on what you're eating. So that's going to be some really interesting stuff that's going to go to further that research along that right on campus is cutting edge stuff. And there's also going to be some on-campus and off-campus gardens and regenerative practices that are going to be that are taking place, growing things side by side using different farming practices to show how regeneration can work as a farming practice. And then he's working with Emmanuel Roux, who's a popular farmer in St. Pete, to build gardens all over the place. I think they're targeting a lot of churches and building these regenerative gardens all over the community to try to feed underserved community and stuff. So really beautiful project. I'm not involved with it. I'd love to be, but I'm just highlighting something that's already taking place on campus that if I was a student looking for something to volunteer for, certainly would be something I'd be reaching out and learning about. So one thing to kind of start with is it gets into some ideas for USF. It's important to note that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in sustainability, and USF's done a lot of it. I mean, this picture that is on the screen here is of solar panels that you guys already have on campus. And the traditional sustainability stuff, energy efficiency, renewable energy, water efficiency, composting, recycling, all that stuff is really wise to do and stuff that some of it you guys are doing, some of it you guys could obviously continue to work on. And is really important to start with. So it's not just all about land, start with the low-hanging fruit that's there and continue to work on that. And then look at all that land that you have. I drive by USF almost every day, and just there's so much land there. And what could we be doing with it to create more life with all that land that you have in strategic ways? So one thing that you can look at is some native ground covers. This is perennial peanut. It's one of my favorite plants. It's native to Florida. It grows really easy and really beautifully. It grows to be about 3-4 inches tall, has this yellow flower on it that bugs tend to like. Never needs to be watered, never needs to be fertilized, can grow in full sun, and needs to be mowed much less than regular grass. The most irrigated and fertilized crop in the United States is lawn grass. And you guys, I assume, probably are using some reclaimed water for at least some of it. But with all I've seen on campus, there's a lot of grass that's probably getting some irrigation on it on campus. So you can kind of look at some areas, not necessarily talking about the quads where the nice St. Augustine grass would be great to lay on. But, there's cities, city of Oldsmar right now has perennial peanut in their medians on some of the roads. Things like that where, just lower maintenance, easier to maintain, and also has environmental benefits to it would make a lot of sense to do campus-wide. Another idea, look for pollinator gardens and build them all over the place. This is a really small one here. You could do these all over campus in different spots and have butterflies. There's a lot of butterfly host plants and nectar plants that you could literally just plant that are native, that grow without you doing anything, that will produce the next species of butterflies and make your campus more beautiful. Really easy thing to do. I'm working right now with a construction company that's going to be doing a 700 square foot certified butterfly garden in the next few weeks here. These types of things, you could put them just about anywhere and they would create life around them. I'm the bamboo fence guy from the stadium, so of course I'm going to recommend something with bamboo. But we could be capturing carbon on campus, and bamboo is a great plant. There's a lot of other plants you could use as well. But find some strategic places where you want some shade and grow some bamboo there, and or windbreaks. It does a lot of good things. And then it's a little bit in its infancy, but figure out how to work with vendors that can harvest that stuff and turn that into the napkins that you're using on campus, or the cups that you're using on campus, or paper that's going in your copiers, and be able to tell the story that this pamphlet that's on your table, this little placard that's on your table, is made out of atmospheric carbon that got sequestered through bamboo grown on campus. That'd be really cool. I think there's a lot of stuff that we could do around bamboo on campus. And then just more broadly, I would say, as my overall takeaway, is put life at the center of decision making. So as a professor, as a dean, as a student, as faculty and administration at the school, in your business and personal decisions, put life at the center of it and see ask the question of how can I put life or love or health or beauty, whatever words you want to use there, into something, and put up a few less aluminum fences and a few more bamboo fences or something like that. So one thing with knowing there's some students on here, I did want to give a little bit of advice for students at the stage of your career developments that you are. my broken record, because I hope that you guys remember it. If you remember anything from what I talk about, is, put life at the center of your decision making. So that can be your personal life, or what career that you choose, or how you buy your groceries. Start to put life into those decisions and think about it a little bit differently than maybe you're conditioned to do in certain things in our society. I would also recommend to get your hands dirty. Go out and play in dirt. The other day with my girlfriend, we were planting a perennial peanut. We were transplanting some perennial peanut, and we were talking about how it just made us feel so much happier to have our hands in the soil. And there's actually chemicals that are in the soil that get released that increase oxytocin in your brain. There's some science behind it, but go get your hands dirty. It's fun and good skill to have, and you'll probably be happier. For sustainability students, don't discount traditional sustainability. That is needed, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, like I talked about, and it can pay the bills. But as you're looking to build a career, regeneration is a really interesting thing to specialize in and learn a little bit more at. I would also recommend learning a lot about adaptation. That's not in this presentation, but it's something I'm learning about and trying to do. How do we mitigate stuff, which I think regeneration is probably the best, or certainly my favorite mitigation strategy that we have, and how do we adapt to what may be coming and what's already coming with some of these climate changes that we have. There's a lot of great opportunities for traditional solar energy and different practices like that, but a lot of this too, you want to develop and carve out a brand for yourself as you're doing that in this transition ahead. And then my last piece of advice would be, if you haven't already, look to begin your transition out of this current system without, getting into doom and gloom. Like, this system environmentally, as one major example, is not sustainable, right? To use that buzzword. And so start to look for ways that are creating life in your decisions and are transitioning out of this system. So one way that I do it, I do food rescue, where I pick up from a local grocery store food that would otherwise be wasted. I feed my family off of that, and I donate it to charity and work with a charity that sees that it gets used. And that's a way that I can meet my needs. I also grow a bunch of my food and do a lot of that as well, but I can meet my needs that I would traditionally be buying from a grocery store, which I consider to be a pretty highly degenerative system that is not sustainable. But how do I find my way to exit that system and then use my energy, my time, my money towards things that are more regenerative, creating life? So look for ways to do that. It's different for where you are in your life, but start this transition, and it's okay to not buy into the system entirely. Certainly not in with where things seem to be headed. Wanted to I'll blow through this relatively quickly, but for some resources and education, anybody who's interested in regeneration, I would direct you first and foremost, go to regeneration.org. It's Paul Hawkins' newest project, if you're familiar with him. Really amazing website with more resources than you could read in a month. Kiss the Ground. If you haven't seen that, watch Kiss the Ground on Netflix. It's an amazing documentary that really gets into regenerative agriculture and how that's done. Regeneration International is an amazing organization and website that I would recommend that you dig into from an agriculture perspective as well. Place that I love and really respect is the 4 per 1,000 initiative. They have like a 3.5-minute video right on their homepage that explains carbon sequestration through soil better than any video that I've seen on it. So at least is worth a look there. But they're an amazing organization. Regenerative Shift is one of a handful of U.S. companies that is a partner of theirs and is helping to do that. I think it'd be really cool for cities and universities and stuff to read their mission and to support some of that stuff as we look to scale this on a global level. Shameless plug for regenerativeshift.com. Have a lot of resources there. Would certainly love for anybody to check out that stuff and find the resources and education tab there. The Rodale Institute that I mentioned has tons and tons of information. They're heavily involved with a regenerative organic certification process where you can get labels on food that show that it's grown regeneratively, which is an important step in the process. And then finally on this page, the International Living Building Institute and Living Building Challenge. For anybody who's wants to play in the built environment, which I do, Living Building Challenge is a really interesting way to look at the future of building that is definitely worth exploring for those wanting to do, looking for regeneration. One last thing to kind of talk about, in addition to Regenerative Shift, I'm a board member on a nonprofit that just started called We Regenerate. It's weregenerate.earth is the URL. We'll have a website up here shortly. We are trying to scale regenerative solutions. So our mission is to scale regenerative solutions by connecting organizations, projects, and individuals with regenerative goods, services, knowledge, and networks. So the idea is anybody at any stage of their life or business that wants to take the next regenerative shift can go to this database that we're creating, this website that we'll have, and learn more on how to do it. So we are looking to grow this. We just got some funding and just got a fiscal sponsor, and are working to go through this process relatively quickly from here. There are some volunteer opportunities if you are able to, or know somebody who can help with database development and research, or marketing, social media, website design, or grant writing. We're definitely looking for some volunteers to help with that. So you can contact me. Would love to connect you with the team on that. And with that, I'll say thank you guys very much for listening to me, and we'll open it up to any questions or comments that we may have at this point.
All right, thank you, Caleb. Very enlightening presentation. So are there any questions out there from the audience? Well, let me deal with the silence a little bit. Okay, so there are a lot of terms that get moved around, such as sustainability, food security, resiliency, and all those type of things. Now, regeneration. How do you feel that regenerative fits into that sort of era of ways of dealing with, food security, or, resiliency, environmental stuff? I mean, how does it fit into that? Do you see regeneration?
Sure. Well, it's important, and there's like this fight for this buzzword, right? Like it's it's which word are you going to use to describe what you do these days. What I like about regeneration is it is focused on nature and the way that nature works. Basically, if you leave it alone, or if you kind of work with it on that. So I think I think that gives it an opportunity to hopefully be more inspirational and more connected to what an author that I really like says, the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. If you sit outside and watch the way nature works, and put your hands in the soil, like that is inspiring, and has a chance to connect people with this inner being, I think, that most people maybe have. Sustainability has been a buzzword for a long time, and is we need to do a lot of things. Sustainability at its core is really great, but it's stale, and it hasn't really moved the needle as much as it needs to. So when you get into some of the things like resiliency or adaptation and some of those buzzwords, they're a little less hopeful. I think we're all needed, and there's people that we need in every one of these different spaces, and I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but for me, I found regeneration to be a hopeful word, and something that has the opportunity to inspire people, and to look, if we can focus on creating life, that's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah, it's funny. I wrote a paper a few years ago about environmental justice, because I'm an environmental justice scholar, and I was trying to say, okay, well, environmental justice basically says that we've realized that certain communities have been disproportionately affected by environmental degradation, whatever. But what are we going to do about that? And so I came up with this concept of a restorative environmental justice, such as with brownfields and things, where you take a community and you almost restore them back to a certain amount of productivity, right? And so that's why I was thinking about regeneration is a little more, like you said, it's a little more towards the natural world. I was looking at sort of more of an urban world where we restore things rather than regenerate. So in a way, it's interesting how we always have these various terms, how we try to get across, the solutions that we want to apply.
Sure.
But I think I love regeneration because it does have this sense of life-giving, bringing things back to a certain functionality that's beneficial for all.
Yep.
Any other questions out there?
Hi, Dr. Dorsey. We also have a student question. I believe Caitlin had raised her hand.
Okay.
Caitlin, are you there? Oh, she says she doesn't have access to her mic right now. Okay.
I think it was, she put something in the chat, right?
Maybe
Said, I
she
do
can-
have a question around the use of invasive native plants as regeneration. I saw a quick video today and I am used to thinking of invasive as completely bad, but this video discussed the benefits of specifically native invasive species as almost a reset for regeneration. So typically, invasive is typically used for non-native species in like most stuff that I'm learning. When you have a plant that is invasive, it's coming in and choking out what is naturally around, or what would be maybe you're trying to grow. There are absolutely very aggressive native plants that would be very close to invasive stuff as well. Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of native plants, and I kind of look from a native and permaculture perspective. So how are we producing food and then also helping the environment through the process? And native plants have a tendency to do that. And typically, like when you're talking about an invasive native, you're probably referring to something that most people would call a weed, and probably a pretty aggressive weed. You know, weeds are very misunderstood. I'm not saying that there's always you always want them everywhere where they show up, but weeds, you know, like there are some plants that, you know, whereas like if you're growing a tomato, that tomato takes a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, and somehow through a miracle or whatever you want to call it, turns that nitrogen into this nitrogen rich tomato that you can eat and taste like a warm summer day. But a tomato plant can't get nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It has to get it from the soil. So if you have, it will deplete the nitrogen that's in the soil. But there are other plants that can breathe in the nitrogen through their photosynthesis that's in the air and literally deposit that in the soil. So marigold is an example of one with tomatoes that is a nitrogen fixing plant, and you plant that next to tomatoes and it will help to increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil. But many of these nitrogen fixing plants are things we call weeds. And so like if you were to look at like a lot of these weeds are growing, well, they happen to be the things that are nitrogen fixing, and they're growing in spaces because the soil doesn't have as much nitrogen as other plants would need in order to grow and thrive. And so the concept that we've had of certainly using pesticides and herbicides to kill these weeds, that's really bad. But even pulling them and disturbing the soil and removing them, some of them have purposes, and so you can be a little more strategic and knowledgeable and realize that nature has a way of working that is like a lot of times has a plan that maybe is a little smarter than we give it credit for. Joseph asked, what kind of work are we doing are you doing in construction? Are there any standout examples of projects that challenge conventional harmful building practices? So there are what Joseph might be referring to. I mean, that, you know, the way that we build things currently is highly extractive. I mean, the process of making concrete involves mining, it involves high heat and carbon dioxide emissions, it involves shipping things over long periods of spaces, and really a lot of what we do in building is does not work. And won't work in the long run. It's unsustainable, and sometimes dramatically so. There are lots of different products that you can look at. You know, I'll give one, Joey, hempcrete. That would make a lot of sense. It's grown from hemp and can be used for insulation and for you know, for buildings. That would work really well. There's challenges to this because our traditional building code is written so that we can't use hempcrete because it doesn't have the right R value. It gets its insulation factor a slightly different way, and so there's challenges to even doing a lot of this natural building, and there's a lot of development that needs to take place of these technologies. One of the things with we Regenerate that we're trying to do is build a database that has some of these different Forest Stewardship Council products and some of these more sustainable building products to be able to try to help people who are looking to do more of these natural buildings. But it is kind of challenging because typically at this point a lot of that costs a little bit more money or is, you know, is a little bit harder to do. But there are you can go, like I mentioned, the International Living Building Institute. You can go there and look at some incredible buildings that are taking place that are Going beyond, certainly there's plenty of net zero buildings that are out there, and from a carbon standpoint, those are wonderful. But it's how are you incorporating nature into the ways that you're doing things? How are you including the landscaping, including different ways to build that will provide habitat and do that type of stuff. And so I would recommend you go to the Living Building Challenge and see some of those buildings for incredible examples.
Fantastic. I appreciate it.
Have a question from Carl. What's your take on using weed block fabric? I know plastic is not good as weed block material, but what about cloth-based material or newspaper? So in my experience with weed block fabric, it breaks down over time, and it's kind of a mess when you do it, and it doesn't really break down in a way that biodegrades all that well. Maybe it does over 15 years or something, Carl. I prefer if you, it kind of ties in with like my conversation somewhat on weeds. I kind of like weeds to some degree, so I'm a little bit more of a natural person than putting down a whole lot of weed block. I like using cardboard, like old boxes and things like that. Newspapers, like you mentioned, I think makes a lot of sense. There's a little bit of chemicals in some of the cardboard. You have to remove the tape and make sure it's clean, so it's not a 100% perfect solution, but it's pretty good. And over time, that will block the weeds for a while, and then will eventually, in about a year, will turn into soil. So if you do, you clear the air, you put down your a layer or two of cardboard, plant through that, it will keep the weeds down, and then eventually will turn into soil. It's biodegradable much more quickly than the weed block fabric. You will, a couple of years from now, you will have some weeds growing in that area. It's not going to keep everything down for long periods of time, but nature loves weeds. If you're trying to avoid weeds for long periods of time, it's gonna, you might need to pull some or do something that maybe isn't the most environmentally friendly.
Okay, so I think our time is pretty much come to an end for this presentation. I'd like to thank you again, Caleb, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you. And I would just say, social media, I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn with Regenerative Shift. Easy to find there. My contact information's up on the screen. Please email me if you want to connect and talk, or learn anything that I can do to help. Would love to scale up regeneration. And like I said, we're working with Regenerative Shift to try and we're working with We Regenerate to try and scale this on a nonprofit level. Regenerative Shift is doing it obviously as a business here, but really passionate about it and would love to talk more.
I see Kelly, you want to have the final word?
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. I wanted to thank Caleb for, again, your expertise, the excellent presentation, and thank you for offering to our students to connect with you. It's really important in our college that we, build that professional network. And so I appreciate you being one of our new partners. We look forward to seeing you hopefully at our global conference in November.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Caleb. Thank you, everyone.
Oops, sorry. The next presentation is going to be on Thursday, September 22nd. That'll be Marko Bajic, who's the general manager of the Office of HRH Crown Prince Alexander in Serbia. And so be there for that one. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.